It is Friday, June 28th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Dawn Trail episode of LTPS. Quick little PSA here before we get into it, but I do have to film this a bit earlier than usual because today I'm actually going to be in Pennsylvania for Too Many Games, which, by the way, if you're going to be there, and if you spot me, by all means, come up, say hi. Always love chit-chatting with anybody that's been a viewer of the channel. It's always so fun. The only caveat is you have to tell me what kind of games you're buying or what you already picked up, because I myself will certainly be buying some video games. Let me tell you what. But with that in mind, I do have to film this early to get there, so there might be a window where if a major news story breaks out and I'm not talking about it, well, that's why. But with that in mind, let's begin, as always, with our PS Plus reminder. So, the June PS Plus Essential lineup. This is your last call to claim these games before they go away. July 2nd, it's going to change over to Borderlands 3, PS4, PS5, NHL 24, PS4, PS5, and Among Us, PS4, PS5. Now, folks, let me tell you, they're not bad games, but in terms of value, we're not looking too good. Among Us is like a $5 game on PSN. It's been like that the entire time. There is nothing impeding you on buying and playing that game if you really did want it. NHL, I mean, I've always been very vocal about this, but I feel like you should never put sports games on the essential tier where there's only 3 games. And sports games almost always are the kind of titles that come out every year. They speak to a certain audience that are probably going to buy that game if they really want it every single time it comes out. Also, in terms of regional preference, that plays a big role. So NHL, okay, that might be good for North Americans, but everywhere else, maybe not so much. Although sometimes they do change a title out and put something else in place for different areas throughout the world. So maybe they're doing that here. I don't know just yet. But either way, I still think it's a bad option unless they offer a 4th game, which they're clearly not doing. And then Borderlands 3, it's a good game. It's a great game even, but the title's been on sale many times over, and I think it's been on Extra, or it's on Extra right now. There's always that crossover too. So value-wise and just what they're offering, I mean, this is like one of the worst months, I would say, in a very long time. It seems like we've had a lot of these happening more often than not lately. But anyway, in other PlayStation Plus related news, we can talk about Sly Cooper, which we've seen the game now go live on PSN with the other brand new PS2 titles, and we're finding out based on some preliminary info that it might have seen the biggest debut for a classic game on PS Plus Premium. So this comes to us from True Trophies, where they're using a sample of data that tracks 3.1 million active PSN accounts, and that's in collaboration with Game Insights. They've been doing this for a while, so they've always been putting up this data, and so recently they've determined that Sly Cooper is indeed the biggest debut on PS Plus Premium so far. The highest ranked debut beforehand was The Legend of Dragoon, but Sly was a little bit higher with a 2.5% higher player count. So not a lot, but just enough to be the new biggest debut. And it was actually the 8th biggest PS Plus game of 2024 so far, amongst all the other, more well-known titles or marquee headline titles. And then Tomb Raider Legend also managed to rank quite high as well as the 3rd biggest debut, right underneath The Legend of Dragoon. So we're seeing a lot of big player spikes showing up for these brand new PS2 games, which we'll always mention, Sony does track this telemetry very closely. Now, we didn't need this to prove that, but it is something where we can reference the Insomniac breach, where we had those slides show up for the company's, sort of strategy overview for PlayStation Plus with the relaunch of the new tiers, Extra and Premium. And if you remember, we went over that slide where they were talking about Premium and the lifetime to date top titles, where a lot of it was dominated by first party titles that were also in relation to recent transmedia debuts. So that would be like The Last of Us HBO or the recent release of God of War Ragnarok, right? So we saw the God of War titles rank quite high, which we had the streaming titles for the God of War collection. That was like number 3 as the most played game on PlayStation Plus Premium for the Classics catalog. But we did also see that 3 of those games were emulated titles, so they were the more recent new PS1 or PSP games. Which, at least in the context of this conversation, that's the kind of classic games that we're really looking at. But we know that generally, first-party games, the interest is very high. The, emulated titles that you can play locally, that ranks quite high as well. And having something like Sly Cooper debut, it's encouraging, right, to see that much discussion surrounding Sly Cooper, because I've seen a lot of people this past week say it was either their first time playing the game or it was something where they finally played it again after 20-something years. Like, let's say they never bought it on PS3 PS3, and everyone kind of collectively saying like, yeah, this still hits. I love this game. I think this is a great property. And so it's one of those things where it's planting the seed, right? Nothing's happening right now for Sly Cooper, or many other dormant Sony IPs, but over time we can see this shift start to happen, which to Sony's credit, they've been doing the Classics program since 2022 now at this point. It's been a very slow rollout, but with PS2 games and the interest now spiking for a lot of these well-known titles, and I expect we will see eventually God of War and Ratchet & Clank and other Sony IP have similar debuts where it's going to be a very high player count. It's looking good for classic games. And that's in spite of how the emulators are still in not the best shape. So there's still a lot left to be desired, but we are making progress. Slow progress, mind you, but I'm still just happy to see something happening in this area. Now, in other classic game news, we can segue nicely into our very big rumor from this past week, and that is PS3 emulation still being worked on for PlayStation 5. This story, of course, being something that I want to talk about right away, so we already did a Tuesday upload going over that rumor, but just as a very quick little recap, it's something where recently Nick Baker on the Xbox Era podcast just talked about how he had heard about this, and then that led Jeff Grubb from Game S Morning's Giant Bomb to also bring this up as well, where he more or less reiterated the same thing that he already heard about 2 years ago. So there's really not much new info on this rumor outside of just two people and one saying it 2 times now with 2 years apart that, hey, I've heard this is coming, and that's basically it. And, every time PS3 emulation comes up, of course, we have to go over that topic because there's just so many verticals to that conversation that I think oftentimes are incredibly misconstrued. So there's just a few other things I'll add to this conversation on top of our Tuesday upload, which is really punching home the idea of, I know everyone when this topic comes up, they bring up our PCS3. And I do not want to undermine the amazing community efforts that team has done for PlayStation 3 and emulating and also preserving those titles to be playable on modern hardware, which is primarily PC. And they're also getting it running, and those games are operating quite nicely on portable PCs as well. Again, I don't want to undermine that kind of work. It's really, really impressive stuff, especially for a community that doesn't have PS3 source code or official documentation. But the crux of the issue is always going to be when you monetize it. When you monetize it, it becomes a whole different ball game. I hate to be the one to say this, but it will never be something where Sony builds a really reliable compatibility layer and it's part of a firmware update, and then just right away you can start inserting PS3 discs and you get to play them for free right off of that. Look, we would all love that, but it's not going to be that. We have the PS1, PSP, and PS2 games right now as a good benchmark. We have the 2016 PS2 games as a benchmark. We have other platform holders, Nintendo paywalls, everything behind NSO. Microsoft, while they do offer a goodwill gesture of honoring discs, it's still a monetized program. They do not open up their emulator. It's very curated in terms of, hey, what can we monetize again? What can we put through QA again, recertify and put back up on the store, and sell to you again if you don't have the disc? If this ever becomes a thing where Sony actually gets this working, it's going to be a very small selection of games. PS3 is still very difficult to emulate. It doesn't matter about our PCS3 or Sony themselves having source code. Arguably, PS5 still does not have the CPU overhead to reliably emulate every single game out there. And the issue is, first-party games were typically the ones that would lean the most into the cell processor. They're the most problematic. You can look this up on our PCS3. Many first-party games are labeled as in-game. They're problematic. They're hard to figure out and get working reliably. That benchmark that our PCS3 uses, I often say that's actually a good reason why this simply will not happen, because it takes a long time to get together, and the amount of money investment that it would take to reliably get it working, they just probably would not see much financial gain from it. So the point I want to get across here to, again, double down on the Tuesday discussion is, I would, of course, love for this to happen, but there's simply so many things working against the entire conversation that I'm still not fully convinced, despite rumors, that it actually is on the way. It would have to be a long, multi-year process, and the thing is, with the rumors, I would almost assume if this was happening, this would be like in Japan with the Sony hardware team, which you're not going to hear rumors about that, right? I'm not very convinced as to the, credibility of if this really will show up at some day. The only argument that has ever made sense is that at a certain point they got to do something, because they're not going to sustain and operate PS3 server blades for the next 10 years when the current ones are already 10 years old and they're incredibly energy inefficient. And so I don't want to retread steps on the entire conversation, but I just want to make it clear that there is still a lot of like fundamental business related problems with making PS3 emulation work financially for Sony. But with that in mind, I do remain hopeful. Moving on to SIE's rewards program, PlayStation Stars, which as of right now, at the time of filming, is still down. And if it's still down by the time you're watching this, then that means 3 weeks it's been completely offline, not working. We still don't necessarily know what's going on. However, we do have some indicators that it should be back online fairly soon, based on a very insightful post on the PS Star subreddit by the user, _Andrew. So they just talked about how on the network side of things, we can see from Sony's end that a lot of things are still tracking correctly. So points are being earned. You can actually verify this yourself if you request your data from Sony in the mobile app. They'll send you a link showing you your point history. But also campaigns have already been starting and expiring during the outage. So clearly they just had a lot of this stuff scheduled like way in advance. So campaigns are like still going and working, even though the entire service to the user is not accessible. So it is something where that's also still tracking correctly as well. You know how sometimes a lot of the campaigns, they auto-register. So there's one for the Ghostbusters movie, and that one already went live. And also if you met the conditions, then you actually already completed that as well. You just still can't access anything, obviously. But we have that. And also another indicator that they might be fixing this soon, because the actual PS Stars like title of the back end is UAT Stars, or User Acceptance Testing for short. So that indicates that they're probably in the final phase of testing the service before they make it live again. So honestly, I expect either it's going to be live today and this news is like outdated, or going into the weekend, it won't be ready until sometime maybe on Monday or Tuesday, right? That's at least speculation on my part. But the company did acknowledge this again by giving away some free PSN avatars. So on their site, they talk about how they're aware people can't claim the Days of Play collectible. So they've put up these codes for some free PSN Astrobot avatars. So not too bad, although I think that's maybe the only goodwill gesture they're going to offer, because I, again, don't really expect anything out of them outside of that. But yeah, it seems like they'll probably have this thing up sooner rather than later. Moving on to the PlayStation Portal, where we have a bit of a problem going on with the most recent firmware, that being version 3.0 that we talked about last week. The main headline feature of that firmware was finally being able to connect to public Wi-Fi spaces, so places like hotels, coffee shops, airports. You can finally bring up a QR code on the portal, scan that with your phone, and then you can agree to terms of service on your phone. That will send back the proper connection, and then you can finally use your portal outside of your home network properly. But the problem is, we're finding out that it really can't do that in nearly all cases, because of a very big caveat that we did overlook on last week's episode, and that is Sony did put in little asterisks that 5 gigahertz signals are not supported, which on its own is already not good, because 5 gigahertz is more preferred over 2.4, but at least that would still imply that you could still use your portal at those locations, right? But actually that's not the case, because the issue with the portal is that you can't choose to connect to 2.4, and most places you go to, whether it's residential or commercial, you know, most places set up their networks as a single SSID, but a 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz band. The portal, you can't force it to connect to the 2.4. It pretty much always tries to connect to the 5 gigahertz band, which means in most cases it doesn't work. So one YouTube channel, the Gamefather, made a really good video about this, where they took their portal to like 10 different locations and just showed that like nearly every single time it just flat out didn't work. They can't even get the QR code to show up, and so it seems like the feature is effectively useless, which is really one of those mind-boggling things. Now, what we can say in terms of the reason why, so on Sony's main site, not the PS blog, where they actually outline the changelog for version 3.0, it does say, and I quote here, "To comply with regulations for various countries and regions, PS Portal might not support connections to certain public networks, such as 5 gigahertz networks." Now, I would have no idea in terms of what countries, regions, or regulations they're abiding to here. I'm sure there is some kind of fringe case out there where they do have to do this. I would not know, but it would seem very odd that they have this like blanket rejection of all 5 gigahertz signals when that flat out kills this thing for a lot of places. I mean, at least here in the US, I know there might be other countries out there where maybe it's more commonplace for businesses to offer 2.4 and 5 as a separate SSID, but at least here in the US, I know in Canada, and also for the GameFather, like the one SSID is very common. So for the Portal to not also at the very minimum have an option to, forcefully pick the 2.4 band, it's one of those things where I saw this and I'm like, yup, like that's something Sony would do, where they'd ship it like this, and it's, in a way, it's completely useless, but it's like, I guess, a good headline at the end of the day to have it look usable to a degree. I don't know, just very, very strange. I mean, and maybe it shouldn't be too shocking because at least for the Portal, like they still have not said anything about this frame pacing issue where there's like every 10, 15 seconds a very minor stutter. A lot of people can't notice it. But it's that problem where the PS5's refresh rate is going to be typically set to 59.94, whereas the Portal's LCD screen is going to be a flat, like, even 60. So there is a very slight frame pacing issue that does occur, and so some people can pick up on it, and it's annoying, and the company has not said anything about it, or they've even so much as addressed it, or clearly they have not fixed it recently. So I guess it's not too surprising, although those kind of issues sometimes will be like swept under the rug for a very long time until they finally do something, and sometimes they don't even they'll fix it, but they won't even put it in a changelog for whatever firmware actually did fix it. But either way, it seems like these things are just, this is definitely the kind of thing where I'm like, this sounds like the kind of Sony that would do some very bizarre decisions during the PS3 and PSP days for those firmware updates. Just, I don't know what they were thinking. Next up, we just had some press previews come in for Firewalk's PvP first-person sci-fi hero shooter for PS5 and PC, Concord, where that game is coming out very soon in August, but we do know before that there is going to be a beta in July, which that's also coming up very soon, and we now have some confirmed dates for that, so if you pre-order the game, you can actually access the beta from July 12th to the 14th, and you'll also get 4 additional beta codes to share with friends, but if you want to hold off and wait to play the game during the open beta period, then that's going to run from July 18th to the 21st, and both of these betas is going to be effectively the full game, so all game modes, all characters should be available, so you'll really get a good idea of exactly how this game plays and feels. And as far as the previews go, it's something where we heard a lot of words from PC Gamer, IGN, GameSpot, a few different places. I've not been able to read everything so far, but it does seem like generally it has been positive, with some caveats, that being just general concerns. Some folks are not entirely convinced as to the long-term viability of the game, or if it will really resonate with a big audience in the same way that something like Helldivers 2 did, which is certainly topical, but I think this being another Helldivers 2 is very unlikely, despite it still being something where I will always reserve judgment until more people are playing the game and we can get a good idea of exactly if the game will find some kind of audience. But a few points we can bring up from the press preview. So the game feels a lot like Destiny. That's what we're hearing, which makes sense given the former Bungie developers that's a lot of what the studio is comprised of. But most of the characters, they have things like double jumps, or one could temporarily hover. Another one has a triple jump. A lot of the movement feels very floaty, and there's a lot of jumping going on. It's very kinetic and fast-paced, obviously, but that does seem to play quite nicely into the maps having some verticality. The characters are also substantially different from one another, so they are really leaning into the asymmetric gameplay, which, some are theorizing it's going to be interesting seeing the community try to figure out what the meta is going to be for the various characters, and also having Firewalk try and balance that, where they still very much do want to lean into the asymmetry, which that does pose a bit of a problem if they want this to be very asymmetric, but also trying to really level out the playing field for all the characters and making one thing not overly powerful versus another. In this game being so PvP focused, that's going to be a very big deal in the long run. But Firewalk also really wants to showcase the characters, and they're really leaning into the narrative portion of this game as well, which, given it being a hero shooter, the characters are something they want to really try and have those characters resonate with the audience as well. So they're planning on making weekly cutscenes of about 2 minutes long, where every time you log into the game, they'll play that scene, and the story is going to play out over time to really flesh out those characters and that narrative. And they're also going to make sure all that content is available, I believe, in-game or also like on their social media channels or something. So over time, you can still keep up with what's going on in the game if you're, say, a later player jumping in 2-3 weeks, 5 months down the line, whatever the case is. So yeah, there's a lot to digest on this one. It does seem like they have a gameplay loop here that is possibly going to be very good. And that's the one thing that I've always been curious about with this title, because this whole way through, a lot of criticism. Oh, Guardians of the Galaxy at home, it looks very derivative, and this game is 5 years too late. All valid criticisms. But there surely must be a gameplay loop here that works to some degree, right? Again, it's something where Sony acquired this studio. They're letting this game go all the way through and they want to ship it, which is a far cry from their long-term roadmap of trying to understand and ship and make live service games, where there's been some trials and tribulations with, bringing in Bungie, that being not exactly the easiest transition, and then also canceling Last of Us multiplayer, Twisted Metal, shutting down London Studios, also Destruction All-Stars did not really land in a very big way. So there's been some growing pains, but this one is going to ship. And even though this game is still like absolutely not for me, so my opinion here really I don't think is of much value, but I do want to see what this game does end up doing by the time it does, not only the beta, but ends up shipping, and we'll see if it finds an audience. Next up, let's talk about Stellar Blade, where so far it seems to be doing very well on PS5, based on a recent IPO press briefing where the Shift Up CFO mentioned that the game has sold a little over 1 million units in terms of an estimate, so it seems like it has crossed over that million, which is good for them, so they're pretty happy about that based on the context of this discussion being an IPO press briefing, which they also go into some other aspects of their business. They show off this slide where they're still considering DLC and a sequel for the game as well, which we did catch wind of from the IPO filing as well, so that was all in there before, including them considering a PC version. But we did get some new language surrounding the PC version, where they did mention they couldn't comment on it directly on when or if it will happen due to the contractual relationship, which of course goes back to Sony because we know they have some kind of agreement with them. But what's so fascinating about Stellar Blade and then also shipping right next to Rise of the Ronin is that we have two very different examples of the kind of deals Sony is willing to do nowadays, especially for Rise of the Ronin, where that game itself is also very unique in the sense that that's our first third-party PlayStation Studios game, because up to this point it's always been in-house studios and also external developers, where Sony, even if they contract out and do a second-party game, they still own the IP for whatever game that they're building. But Rise of the Ronin, Koei Tecmo does own that property, so why did that game get labeled as a PlayStation Studios title? And we can probably safely assume it's because the agreement in place does lock that particular game in perpetuity. So while the IP is still in Koei Tecmo's hands, they could in theory do a sequel and say, we'd rather not work with you this time around and ship that everywhere and it's on our own terms. Knowing that the first game can still be considered a PS Studios title, that might be why. So when we look at something like Stellar Blade, we can probably surmise that that game is not a PS Studios title because Shift Up not only wanted the IP in-house, and we can see that they're going for an IPO and they want to obviously scale up and grow and do bigger and better things, so they're not really interested in probably a long-term console exclusive agreement, but that deal probably also implies that it's maybe a short-term 1-2 year thing, and then once that's lifted, then they can really kind of do whatever they want with that game. Whereas with Rise of the Ronin, that particular game, that would be completely within Sony's decision making to ship it somewhere else, do a PC version, or whatever the case is. We can probably, or at least I would speculate that's what's going on with these two games in particular. So having said that, I feel like Stellar Blade is probably just going to see the DLC, the PC version, whenever they can start doing those things. I would suspect they would end up doing that at some point. Now, moving on to a very interesting development that we first heard about at Summer Game Fest, where we got a release date trailer for Black Myth Wukong coming out on August 20th for PS5 and PC, which the news there at the time was that they're not going to be doing a day-and-date Xbox launch as well, because on Game Science's main site, their FAQ mentioned that they were trying to optimize the Xbox Series versions, and they will come later down the road. But now, We have Jez Corden writing for Windows Central, where they asked Microsoft about the issues, and he received this statement from Microsoft. So they say, and I quote here, "We're excited for the launch of Black Myth Wukong on Xbox Series XS and are working with Game Science to bring the game to our platforms. We can't comment on the deal made by our partners with other platform holders, but we remain focused on making Xbox the best platform for gamers, and great games are at the center of that." Jez Corden also mentioned in his report that he had heard whispers in LA during Summer Game Fest that developer Game Science did take some kind of exclusivity agreement from PlayStation. So Jez then argues how this is problematic given that the game was announced for all platforms initially and then became a retroactive console exclusive, and that Game Science gave an answer that furthers some kind of narrative surrounding Xbox and it not being a priority platform for developers, and of course also touching on Series S as well, where the speculation there is that that console is the problem. So that's kind of where the report was getting at and how that concludes. So with all that in mind, what's going on here? Because now we have some conflicting statements on Microsoft straight up saying that we can't comment on deals with our partner studios that they make with, other platform holders. And in that case, this would be Sony. They're not saying it directly, but they're saying it. And then you've got Game Science, where conceivably they've got no reason to lie, because that's not how these things ever go, ever, right? We don't get lies like that. I mean, normally when console exclusivity is in question, eventually after an embargo period, you do get the answer. This game's coming out August 20th, so it's not like we would not have the answer by this point. These things are not kept in secrecy for that long. We would usually find out, and so it would not only be weird to, have it play out in the way that it's playing out, but you've also got Game Science straight up saying things that are more detrimental to their relationship with a platform holder that they eventually do want to ship games on, and so you can't use that kind of language. And then the other giveaway with this is simply that Sony themselves are not treating this as an exclusive at all anyway, right? When Sony does have some kind of agreement, they use it. They will start posting about the game all the time on their social media channels, on the PS blog. They'll have marketing rights. They'll start running ads. The game is coming out soon enough to where they would absolutely be doing that. Sony very much has a very large marketing presence. I mean, they make it pretty well known. And it's not adding up, especially because, and I find this is a very big misnomer to this day with PlayStation, in particular from the Xbox audience, which, to a degree understandable. If you're primarily in the Xbox camp, then you might not know PlayStation nearly as well, and you'll obviously be upset at certain things Sony does, which oftentimes boils down to these kind of agreements. But it is something where Sony would not lock down a game in this type of manner, because that Stellar Blade is really the only time where they ever did something like that, where Project Eve years ago very much was confirmed for multiple platforms. But if you do look back, Sony will only sign on to a game typically when they're getting in at the ground floor, where there's no confirmed platforms for that game just yet, or at the very minimum they will say consoles, PC. It is usually something where, if you do look back, they are very strategic with this, and they don't sort of retroactively swoop in and take these games away from other platforms in the way that people like to think they do. Sony tends to have this very big bad exclusivity monster, but it does not play out the way that people think it does. It really is something where this is very likely some kind of mistake on Microsoft's part, where PR statements can also at times be incorrect or more boilerplate in terms of we think this is what's happening or we assume this is what's happening. It really depends on the particular PR person that sent out that statement. And I think that's probably what's at play here. There's too many things in favor of that's not what's happening the game is not exclusive to Sony. Sony didn't money hat them, right? That seems to crop up a lot with the Xbox audience, is this expectation that, did Sony money hat it? It really doesn't happen like that as often as people think, or in the way they think it does. And the answer they gave very much does kind of go back to something that's been well documented at this point, which is problematic Series S versions. They don't outright say it's Series S, and I would actually refrain from saying that's exactly what it is too, because they flat out didn't say what the problem was. But it's been well documented at this point, and that was the problem with Larian and Baldur's Gate 3, which even during that time there were some accusations back then that the game was being locked down by Sony. But we know that's not what was playing out. It was just really beneficial on Sony's part to have this singular SKU to a degree, well, two SKUs, but basically the same power. So it worked out with a few times where it's been an indirect console exclusive. Moving on to some PlayStation Productions news. We have another Sony IP that might be getting the TV or film treatment, and that is Japan Studios' Ico. So recently during the Easy Allies podcast, Michael Huber was talking about how his friend was able to pitch this to Sony because, as we heard from Michael Huber about 1.5, 2 years ago, in terms of PS Productions really ramping up, Sony has a list of their own IP that they're looking to take pitches on, and really they're just kind of an open book, and they're just letting anybody approach, and just if they have some kind of idea, they can make a pitch, which Michael Huber was saying that Sony's list is very generous, as in it's nearly everything is on that list, which is why Ico is also one that could be submitted as well, which we don't know if this is actually going to be approved, if it'll go through, and we have no idea what it would look like, but I will say the idea of Ico actually getting adapted, if it was done right, could be a very, I would say, borderline beautiful thing if it was done right. I mean, in my head, I would think immediately this would either be animated, and it would be like Studio Ghibli, or it would be like that kind of style, I should say, or it would be, if it was live action, some sort of art house style, like A24 sort of flick, right? I mean, I think if you go about it in that way and really lean into what makes Ico so special, I think that would be amazing if they do it that way. But I think, you know what, the odds are actually kind of good in terms of like maybe it does go somewhere, because we've seen, and it very much is true what Michael was talking about, but it seems like Sony is very much that open, as in like a lot of properties are getting adapted, but it's across so many different deals and services, right? So we're seeing Peacock, Netflix, Amazon. They're going for the big screen. They'll humor animation as well. I mean, I think they are looking to really do whatever sort of IP, you know, what is better suited for that property, and they're getting the right people attached, generally speaking, right? So the one misfire really was the Uncharted movie, but otherwise I think everything so far has been really good. So this I would love to see, and maybe one day we will. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and we had two news story discussion topics from this past week. So we had on Sunday the PSVR 2 rumor about how Sony is making deep cuts to VR funding, and they're only making 2 games apparently in-house. We were long overdue for talking about PSVR 2, so we finally did that. And then Tuesday was the PS3 emulation rumor, which we also talked about again on this episode, but just going over that again. And then coming up, if I can schedule them in time, we should actually have another Sunday conversation, and then our standard Tuesday upload as well. And again, if you're at Too Many Games, hope to see you there. It's always super fun meeting you all and chit-chatting and just enjoying this lovely hobby. So with that in mind, that is it. That concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.